Today I'm speaking with Tracy Woodgrains, who is the editorial assistant at Blocked and Reported, a great American podcast. And he's also known for his popular articles on Substack. And recently, Tracy Woodgrains wrote an article called "The Republican Party is Doomed." And that's where I want to start, is talking about that. Trace and I had a conversation about this on a mutual friends podcast, DAIN FITZGERALD. Maybe I'll link that in the show notes. But yeah, I'm excited to do a follow-up on that. Trace, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so this article you wrote, "The Republican Party is Doomed." Can you spell out the basic argument that you pitched there?
Absolutely. The elevator pitch for the article, essentially, is that, well, people have in mind the young have always voted left, the educated have always voted left. If you look at the data, education polarization and age polarization have been increasing to a substantial degree. And it's gotten to such a point that even as the Republican Party maintains approximate electoral parity, they are almost completely absent among young educated professionals who ultimately you need to run all the institutions that governance cares about. So even as the Republican Party manages to keep electing people, they have fewer and fewer people to fill all the positions they want to have filled, to do all the things they want done, such that you're reaching a point where they know exactly what they want someone to do and they have nobody left to do it.
So in your article, you linked to a graphic that was from Bloomberg, and it shows all the different various professions that donated to either Biden or Trump. And it's so fascinating to look at, because this does kind of, like, I think, show basically what you're talking about, like in visual form, which is the homemakers donate to Donald Trump versus lawyers, professors, teachers, scientists, etc. There's just a stark divide between the people who donate to Republicans and participate there and the people who donate to Democrats. And it's all, I don't know, like working class or even not working people on the Republican side versus the actual leaders of culture, the people who, like you were saying, know how to run institutions. They are, all supporting Biden. And I mean, there's a lot to, I think, talk about here. There's just so many things that are just so fascinating. But I mean, let's just pick lawyers, for example. You need lawyers to run any sort of conservative organization, right? Or, even political parties. You need lawyers. And we kind of saw this with the Trump campaign, that he had so many incompetent people in his administration that, he went through lawyers left and right, and you just kind of like see these people on TV, and a lot of them are just like attractive people who kind of look like they're almost LARPing as lawyers. They're not really lawyers necessarily, or they're not the people you'd want to hire to represent you. They just look good on TV. Is that a good representation of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can go through, you can look at the top 100 law firms in the country, like the largest law firms. The great, great majority of them, the vast majority of their political donations from their employees will go to the Democrats. And there's maybe one or two, I want to say, where the majority go to Republicans, and even there, the majority just is not nearly as stark as it is with Democrats. So yeah, you see with Donald Trump, like his lawyers, he finds a Cooley Law grad, and for those who don't know, Cooley Law has a reputation not undeserved of being the worst law school in the country. It's not the sort of person that you expect the most powerful man in the world to find to represent him. You just have these absolute bottom of the barrel lawyers who do this stuff. And if you look at the profession more broadly, it's not just that you need people to staff these professions. It's, say you are making a law. What will the legal challenges to that law be? Who will be arguing about those legal challenges? Who will be defending the law on the merits? Will people want that law to succeed? Will people want that law to fail? To what extent will the people tasked with enforcing that law want to resist that law? And this applies especially with things like education administrators. Education's been such a hot button thing for Republicans, and they're talking about, say, trying to do these crackdowns on various, say, DEI things in universities or whatever. Nobody in the universities actually really sides with them for those crackdowns, which leads to this awkward tug of war where they're trying to swing a big stick around wanting people to want to follow them, wanting these administrators, wanting these educators to, agree with them, but in the absence of that, just sort of having to have a wrestle where people at every level trying or tasked with enforcing what they want to have enforced just don't really want to do it.
Okay, so to really crystallize this argument, it is that, let's say, even if 60% of the country reliably votes Republican, let's say we have a very working class based population, which we kind of do, and let's just say hypothetically 60% of them reliably vote red. So Republicans make it into office and they do control a lot of institutions. The argument is that it kind of doesn't matter at some level because all the people who end up running those institutions, the competent ones, they are all Democrats or left-leaning folks inherently, and that is going to color how those institutions ultimately end up running. Is that like a fair assessment of the argument?
Yeah, to a great degree, yes. And I want to emphasize with that it's not that all the people involved are rabid political partisans or anything like that. It's not like everyone who votes Democrat is just absolutely set on politicizing everything, anything like that. It's just a question of general sympathies and general what will someone want to do. But yeah, so you look at political appointees by party, and when you look at who the Republicans appoint as political appointees, I'm going by memory here, but I want to say it's about like 70% Republicans, 20% Democrats, 10% independent, something in that range. You look at Democrats' political appointees, it's like 90% Democrat or more, almost no Republicans. And the reason for that is essentially, I would argue, the distinction in how much of a bench do they have, who is qualified for this position. And if you look at actual qualifications for positions, traditional qualifications especially, Democrats will simply have more options for each of them. If you look at, say, the non-political appointees in federal administration, in government offices in general, it's always been a little more Democrat than it's been Republican, but especially recently and again, going mostly by memory, it's something like a little over 50% Democrats, a little over 25% independents, maybe like 20% Republicans. So whether or not Republicans get electoral office, at no point do they actually have the cultural force in this whole demographic. So this isn't like some calculated ploy by the Democrats, like we are going to install our people in these offices. It's the type of people who are drawn to a position like this are not sympathetic to the Republicans across the whole demographic.
So I grew up really conservative, lived in a small town, religious community, that sort of thing. And so I can relate to being a Republican. And even though now I, live in California and I'm quite a bit more on the left, but I remember distinctly when I was a Republican, and let's say I was like 14 years old, I want to say, I just remember distinctly hating the fact that there were no great musicians who were conservative. It was just a thing that like really ate away at me because I just associated with rock stars and authors and novelists and movie stars. That's just like who I associated with because I always wanted to be a writer and like a musician. So I associated with these people and there were no role models for me. And the people who were conservative-ish rock stars were just like not good, like Ted Nugent or something, But I remember distinctly this feeling that, oh, well, I mean, at least all of the powerful business people are conservative. There must be something to this conservatism thing because look at all the powerful business leaders who are conservative. And I also even had it in my head at one point that there were not only all the rich people, but also all the highly educated people were conservative. At some certain points in American history, that was kind of true. What is going on with conservatism or republicanism that not only does the left fully still control, I mean, all of culture effectively, like all the authors, all the musicians, all of Hollywood, it is still like very, even like the conservative types in those worlds, like let's say Barry Weiss or whatever, as an author in that world is considered conservative. She's still like super on the left, like considered like what I used to be as a conservative, like a real, religious conservative. And now at the same time, it seems like there are fewer and fewer powerful people, powerful figures even in business or academia or like anywhere who's on the right. So I want to like that's my question, like what's happening there, but at the same time there is a little bit of a cultural meme of the left has lost its mind, right? And I talk about this. It's fun to talk about like the problems of the left. This is like one of the rare instances where I'm talking about the problems on the right because the left is so much more fun to talk about. But so there is something to the fact that the left has lost its mind, and you get like Dave Rubin types who are saying, oh, look, everyone's coming on the right. Or Joe Rogan says this sometimes, like everyone's coming over to the right side because the left has lost its mind. Well, I mean, like, help me understand what the broad ecosystem looks like, given that it seems like on the one hand, the right doesn't really control anything anymore. And then at the same time, there's this kind of like semi-powerful narrative that the left has lost its mind. How do you make sense of this?
Absolutely. I think the key for me in making sense of it is understanding the role that Christianity has played in the history of the United States, in the history of US politics, and in the present of US politics, and the ways that role has shifted over time. If you go back, say, 100 years, and you look at the left and right then, you look at progressives back then, you look at all these movements, what you see is that, say, William Jennings Bryan, one of the really doctrinaire progressives of his day, fighting for workers' rights, fighting for all of these like very progressive things of the day, was also fighting against Darwin, was fighting like against alcohol, was saying, evolution is bad, these things are bad, and saying that as an outgrowth of those same progressive but extremely Christian progressive principles. And you saw that as this very visceral force in US politics. At some point, progressivism became detached from this Christian impulse. And particularly, the more and more you get towards modern times, the more you get towards recent times, Christianity, while it is still an overwhelming force in the country, while it is still the dominant religion and still defines so much about so many people's lives, at some point it really got detached from governance in a lot of ways. And at some point we just shifted towards a much more secular world where our arguments became more secular, our framework of the world became more secular. Young people growing up, I grew up in an extremely religious conservative background, but I am an extreme anomaly in that regard, that most people do not grow up with this religious force as the most important force in their lives. And particularly educated people have been moving more and more away from Christianity as this most important force in their lives. So what you have is a situation where what had been this sort of guiding force and guiding like moralist group for a lot of people has particularly as social fights have moved to things like gay marriage, where Christianity was very much on the back foot, moved towards even more modern issues where Christianity is even more on the back foot. You have this situation where what had been able to frame itself as this dominant moral force feels itself on the back foot, feels a new moral force coming in, creeping in. I would argue a new, essentially religious force coming in, creeping in, which is the social justice progressivism that has been, simmering for a while and at some point boiled over and became really, for a lot of people, this new defining movement. The separation of church and state is not a natural thing. The separation of church and science is not a natural thing. So if you look at Christianity over the years, you can go back as far as the Peace of Westphalia, and you start seeing like it took years and years and years and centuries for people to wrestle between Christianity, science, Christianity, politics, to say which of these will have force in which arenas. And over a very long time, Christianity went from being the absolute dominant divine right of kings, unified system of leadership over, we will tell you what is true, we will tell you how to be governed, we will tell you all of these, to, religion has its domain, we have religious freedom, secular things have their own domain, all of this. And that sort of got figured out. As progressivism rises up, as social justice progressivism rises up, it becomes sort of a truly vital religion, is the way I'd describe it, in a way that Christianity mostly stopped being at some point, where suddenly it is interested in the domains that Christianity was sort of pushed back out of, forced to retreat from. It is interested in governance, it is interested in science, and it sort of flexes its muscles in those domains. And so you suddenly have all these educated people who have found this new moral compass, who have found this new moral grounding, who have found this sort of like unified set of beliefs that they can draw towards and that they can teach. And now it's progressivism instead of Christianity with that. And there are a lot of causes for it, but I think that first, that shift to secularization, and second, that rise of this new unified moral system are the key elements.
Okay, so does that partly explain why Republicans today are so anti-institutional? Part of being a Democrat is being like having some faith in institutions, whereas part of being a Republican, it's more of a populist thing, and no matter what the institution is, whether it's higher ed or name an institution, basically there's no faith in it, and that's part of being a Republican in this modern era. Is that part of this?
Yeah, I think so. They recognize, and they honestly recognize, it's not an imagined thing, that for them, the core impetus behind their morality, and a lot of them remain Christian and remain sincerely Christian, whatever that means for them, whether it's evangelical, politics tied with Christianity, or something else. Anyway, they recognize that these institutions don't recognize their moral arguments as legitimate in the same way that these institutions would recognize a progressive moral argument as legitimate. And so they feel instinctively, and I don't think a lot of them put words to this, but instinctively they do notice, and instinctively they do feel a sense of, hey, this isn't fair. I can't say the things that I believe and have them taken as seriously as you when you say the things you believe, because you're playing this secular game, you're playing this reasoned game, what have you, that you have decided excludes my beliefs and excludes my system. And so, yeah, so they feel a sense of unfairness as they feel pushed to the margins with it.
So I want to get your thoughts on how you think the next election is going to go. And my perspective on this is Peter Zion talks about this a lot, but I think he's correct on it, that this is kind of the first time in modern history where the Republicans have been fractured in a way that historically the Democrats always have been. All the little fractions never get along with each other, and that's always been a problem. Whereas like now, today, there is the Trumpists on the right, and then there's everybody else, like the anti-Trumpists, the rhinos, right? And that is going to, Peter Zion will argue that is going to fracture the Republican base to such an extent that they are going to be, and they're not going to win anything for the foreseeable future because of this, until Trumpism goes away and they can maybe unite again. Do you think that is going to be an actual problem for Republicans? Or do you think that they're still going to be able to unite enough to win in elections? I mean, putting aside, I guess, the issue whether or not they can govern, do you think that they have the support they need to be able to win elections?
Do I think the Republicans can win elections? Yes, I absolutely think, especially at the presidential level, I don't see any reason to distrust the polls that show that it's a very tight race at the presidential level, that ultimately disparate factions will unite enough that they can remain competitive at that level. And state by state, it depends on the state. I think the Trumpist path. So the problem I see with Trump, and look, this isn't original. Nothing anyone says about Trump is ever going to be original. But the problem I see is that he is much less ideologically driven and much more personality driven. And so the question of whether someone is a rhino or not is not, do they support these policies that have been traditionally associated with conservatism? The question is, do they nod along when Trump says something, and do they follow his whims, generally speaking? And, that seems to have worked in terms of uniting a big chunk of the Republican Party around this personality, around this cult of personality around Trump. But it really seems to be a loser in a lot of close races in state politics in general. You know, you see a lot of these Trumpist candidates really falter because they don't have, there's no unique appeal to them, and there's no necessarily like, we are definitely within this concrete ideological sphere. It's, we are trying to dance to the winds of whatever happens to be the wind around Trump. And I don't think that has proven to be an electoral winner around for a lot of these down ballot candidates, but it seems to be perfectly successful for Trump himself.
Okay, yeah, I could see some of that. I want to pivot to some culture questions. Given that you are well known for having your finger on the pulse of the culture, let me first ask a cultural question that's still kind of related to politics. What do you make of the left has lost its mind idea? Do you see that the people who are going around saying that are, I mean, is that leading to for people to abandon leftism, Dave Rubin style, or do you see it more of Anna Kasparian style, where calling out people on the left for being kind of crazy, but still proudly wearing their leftist badge? You know, David Pakman is still in that same world too. There are quite a few people who actively call out the left for having, quote, lost its mind, but stay on the left. So given that, you know, you're so active online and I think have your finger on this pulse a little bit, what do you think? Do you think that line of thinking, or just observing that the left has lost its mind, is it actually helping Republicans or not so much?
Yeah, to that, a couple of points. So first off, I do think it is always critical to distinguish between leftists and liberals, and conservatives don't always distinguish between them, and I think it's almost always a mistake not to distinguish between them because there are really significant and really important ideological distinctions. However, within both leftists and liberals, you have cultural progressivism. So you have progressives who are virtually all leftists, and a really good chunk of liberals are progressives. And, you know, some progressives are leftists, some progressives are liberals. All progressives will basically hew to this general, broader cultural pattern. In terms of has it lost its mind, this goes back to my take of it being essentially a new pseudo-religious movement, is that I think as a new pseudo-religious movement, it is in its growing pains stage. It is in its idea generation stage. It is in its flex its power stage. It is in its see what works and see what doesn't stage. And so what you see are some of these wild purity spirals. You see some of these like wild reaches into, can we control this? Should we control this? You see these trying to really strongly control some of its adherents' behavior and thoughts and everything. And you see pushback against that. And from that pushback, you see some fraction of people who take this Dave Rubin, James Lindsay path, where they just lean hard into the Republican Party. And then you see a lot take this, say, Barry Weiss or Katie Herzog path of just kind of being skeptical of a lot of it, but not really like no interest in the Republican Party proper. And then you see a lot in the more Jesse Singal, Anna Kasparian, David Pakman, Destiny, people like that path, where they will call out, here are these dumb things on the left, here's this silliness, here's that, but they will still fundamentally have zero interest in and zero sympathy towards the Republican Party. Then you have reactions, subtler reactions that are harder to notice from outside progressivism, within progressivism itself, well, where they will see all of that and they will react culturally to that in subtle ways and sometimes less subtle ways, where suddenly progressivism itself will shift and mold to an extent to stop driving people away quite so much. And so there's this whole ecosystem, there's this whole web of reactions that happens to it. Like sometimes, yes, some people will completely boil off, sometimes people will boil off less. I think the thing that really hurts Republicans, and the reason why this whole I left the left stuff is, a lot of it is more of a mirage than a lot of them would like to think, is that the Republican Party, as we're talking about with my point of Republican Party being doomed, particularly among young educated professionals, it just does not have a lot to offer young educated professionals. It really doesn't. If you are not Christian, if you are not really committed to a specific subset of cultural issues, if you are not white, if you're not a man, like obviously these are identity things, but identity things do matter to an extent. It just has very, very little to offer you. And there's a lot where you will be constantly reminded of people pushing against you. You know, Dave Rubin is happy where he's at, and I'm not going to act like he's like illegitimately so or anything like that. But he also, when he posts pictures of his babies online, a massive wave of people who are ostensibly his allies. You know, some of them will be really cool about it, and a lot of them will just mock him mercilessly for it. And that's not, you know, more power to him if that's what he wants, but that's not what a lot of people in a position like him will want. And, you know, people see that, and it's not appealing. It's not fun. That's not a satisfying, rich intellectual environment full of interesting thoughts. It just isn't. So, no, I think that progressivism is in its growing pains stages, and it's making a lot of really obnoxious mistakes and correcting to some of those to an extent. I think the Republican Party will gain to an extent from them. I don't think it has the focus. I don't think it has the competency, and I don't think it has the vision to appeal to a lot of the people who could otherwise be turned off by this stuff before this stuff ends up self-correcting enough to more or less draw them back into the fold-ish.
So I lived in San Francisco the last couple of years. I'm in Sacramento now, but I lived in San Francisco during the height of cultural craziness. And interestingly, I feel like I contributed it to some degree because when I first moved there, did vote for a lot of the candidates and policies that ended up being kind of crazy. But I was just kind of curious to see, you know, will these things work? And I had like an open mind about a lot of them. You know, Chesa Bodine and a lot of these figures who were like very, very progressive. I was like, okay, you know, they make some arguments. Let's give it a whirl. And this was at the same time when, you know, Oregon was decriminalizing all drugs. Also, you know, an experiment. And we've kind of seen that those experiments just kind of sort of failed. And I don't think that it was all a lost cause. I think that that's part of what a democracy is. You get to try things out, and if they fail, okay, change the policy, right? Like Oregon just did, and like San Francisco just did. Before I moved out of San Francisco, the last time I voted, I did vote against a lot of those progressive policies. So that's, even though like my core political beliefs didn't really change, you know. So I think that's probably how a lot of people feel. But okay, you know, here's my question for you on this in this regard. Let's say you're just a voter and you're pragmatist and you're someone who's liberal, but you don't like the left's craziness. And since you're a liberal, you feel like maybe you are somewhat responsible for this and your actions can change it. Unlike the shit that's happening on the right, this is, you know, speaking for myself, I feel like that's their own baggage. They need to take care of that, but I can maybe clean up some of the baggage on the left, right? Okay, so you're being totally practical about this. Is James Lindsay onto something that to clean up the left, you have to vote for Republicans. You have to vote for Donald Trump and lean into it. Not because you believe it, but like cynically because the left has really gone too far and you need to vote against those fuckers, that sort of thing. Or do you think that that's the wrong approach and someone on the left shouldn't even be tempted by that? And again, with the goal of cleaning up the messy extremes of the left, what do you think the practical, or what should a pragmatist do in this regard?
I think that a political party is an entity that exists with the goal of getting elected. And given that goal, it means that it will very naturally lean to the priorities of the people who are within it. So you see this move from Marxists all the time, from far left all the time, where they look at the Democrats and say, I just cannot possibly support these guys. These parties are both the same, and these Democrats are just completely not nearly radical enough for us, not nearly extreme enough for us. So screw them, screw voting, screw all of this. And so they don't vote, and the Democrats are like, all right, well, screw you guys too. And the reaction isn't, oh, we're going to change towards you. The reaction is, well, if we can't get you, then we're going to turn somewhere else for votes. And so the more, say, someone like that starts saying, oh, I won't vote for Democrats, the more the Democrats are straightforwardly incentivized to push towards the center, towards people who will vote for them potentially. So if people from the center start peeling over to the right, and saying, look, we're going to vote against Democrats, blah, blah, blah. Yes, you could make the case, oh, Democrats don't want to lose these votes. You can also see Democrats saying, well, we don't hear these voices in our party. We don't hear these people saying these are our priorities, anything like that. These people become enemy rather than friends to us, and suddenly we're a lot less interested in what they have to say, and they will just go over and do their thing. I think there's also the network effect where you see people who make this tactical decision, like, oh yeah, I think the Democrats have gone crazy and I'm going to vote for Republicans. They do that, and they really get absorbed into this broader ecosystem, to the very specific ecosystem where suddenly they start picking up on and start expressing a lot of very strong beliefs that they didn't really express or they didn't really put to the forefront before. Like, people do, their opinions and which opinions they feel are important enough to prioritize do change significantly based on the ecosystem they're hanging out in. So I think someone who elects to vote for Trump to, say left has gone crazy, whatever, winds up really getting absorbed into that Trumpist ecosystem in a lot more ways than they might initially anticipate, which is, I think, something they need to keep in mind with it. From a purely pragmatic stance, I don't really think, I think people should vote for the policies that they think are closer to where they want. Look, I don't particularly like the Democrats. I really don't like the Republicans. When I'm voting, I don't think that my irritation with the Democrats will come out in a productive way that will make the Democrats work more towards my preferences if I vote for the Republicans. I could see a case if someone wants to drag the Republicans more towards them, and this is something that is actually interesting for me. If someone is a young, ambitious person who is vaguely right-leaning in their sympathies and thinks the Republicans are a party of morons, I think there is a very strong case for them to then become a Republican, to, if they're a lawyer, join the Federalist Society, to, if they're an activist, get involved on the ground somewhere. And particularly with the dearth of, young educated professionals in the Republican Party right now, they're really thirsty for talent. And someone like that can suddenly make a real difference on the direction and the scope of the Republican Party by voting for Republicans. But that's not a vote for Republicans because you want the Democrats to act differently. That's a get involved in the Republicans because you can drag the Republicans closer to you line of thinking, which to my eye is a completely different line of logic.
Okay, yeah, I like that a lot. The idea that if you are slightly right-leaning, this is probably prime time to join the Republican Party and do something about it. I think that that's exactly right. I think to have a healthy democracy, we need a more sane Republican Party, just like we need a more sane Democratic Party. But most of the policies Democrats are throwing out there aren't actually that bananas, unlike Republicans, I think. So, okay, I love that comment. That's really great. It's interesting that whether it's the right or the left, everyone ends up talking about the extremes in politics. And this is my next question for you, because again, of all people, you have your finger on the pulse. And so I want to ask you, where do you think the culture war is headed? And I want to ask you this question in terms of I recently went around and asked a lot of people who I know and somewhat like well-known Twitter figures. I was asking them what's the next hot button culture war issue? What's it going to be? And I posted that as an article on the Team Futurism Substack, which like no one subscribes to, by the way. If anybody's listening to this, go check out our Substack. We recently migrated to Substack, so go check us out there. But so I got some feedback of things like, identity issues will get more crazy. We might see transracialism as the new hot button issue, or I got some feedback about AI partners and digit sexuality. So, are we gonna have like fights over the racial or sexual orientation or age preferences with AI partners? That's kind of interesting. Also, people commented that maybe transhumanism is going to become more controversial as we move into like a post-human space with rich people getting augmented in various ways. Okay, so a lot of stuff like along that vein, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about where the next hot button culture war issue is going to come from.
That's a good question. And the first thing I'll say to that is that there are two sorts of next hot button culture war issues. And one sort I feel somewhat confident in making weak predictions about, and the other sort I think it's almost futile to make predictions about. And the first sort is the sort that you can sort of see bubbling up in one microculture for a long while before it shoots to the surface. And the other is the sort that is the reaction to a major geopolitical event. So, for example, you have trans stuff where you can see for decades in advance there were these people in a very small niche subculture looking at it, focusing on it, thinking about it, who it eventually boils up and becomes this really central thing. On the other hand, you have COVID stuff, where people polarized in ways that were completely unpredictable to a lot of people in advance. Like, people looking at it in advance had no clue who would fall down where, and sometimes political parties flipped on a dime to, masks are bad to masks are good, flipped political polarity at some point. Vaccines can't be trusted to vaccines are amazing, flipped political polarity at some point in the middle of these things. And you could see sort of these groups with that, but I don't think very many people at all were able to predict the specific directions the culture war took around COVID. Certainly not in advance of the pandemic. So that said, I'm not even going to try to predict. However, in terms of subcultures bubbling up, things like that, I think that, TikTok is always a good place to look for the hot button cutting edge of culture war craziness. I think that systems, I don't know whether, so when I say systems, I mean people who are under the impression that they are multiple personalities living inside a single body. And if you go into a lot of like ultra progressive discords, or if you go into progressive sectors of TikTok with a lot of really young people, then you do have a lot of people taking this seriously and treating this as something that they need to engage with as if it is an actual legitimate, important, different way of being. And so I don't know that that has the seriousness to really bubble out of those hardcore progressive circles. But if it does, then it would certainly become a major culture war issue. Look, I'm a furry. Furries and furries and the whole trans species stuff, that does exist. There are quiet subcultures where people take the whole trans species stuff very seriously, and where people genuinely act as if they believe that they are animals, that sort of thing. And that's another thing that could boil up. Furries are at large, people panic about them, people freak out. They don't really have any political priorities that aren't met other than we want to hold conventions and do weird stuff. So I don't really, there's no real hook I see for that to become like this central cultural thing other than conservatives every time they notice them. And there's a lot of weird, ugly stuff going on there. Every time conservatives notice that, it's going to boil into a controversy because there's plenty to dig up. But like, I don't know that I see a really strong culture war hook for it. So those are two examples of things that, they could boil up, they could simmer, that they'll toss into controversy at some point. I don't see them really becoming all-consuming the way, say, trans stuff is, except as auxiliaries to that. Surrogacy is one thing that I think still could become a lot more hot button as a cultural issue. It's already present in the cultural conversation, and the more it is visible, the more I think people will polarize and go different directions about it. The United States is something of an outlier in surrogacy laws compared to someplace like Europe, and that's a good hint at a suggestion that something that people just haven't really examined as closely could become higher salience for people, and suddenly there could be a lot more heated disputes around it. I hope not, but it could be, especially as more advanced reproductive technologies come in. You have things like in vitro gametogenesis, which is the process of taking a cell that is not an egg or sperm cell, turning it into an egg or sperm cell, which could theoretically allow, say, gay people to have biological children of both of them being the same. Both of them being the parents, could allow trans people to have biological children, and could general new technologies can always cause this sort of stir. So things like that are some of the directions I would be looking at. I don't know which of them would have the necessary hooks to really jump in, but there are real cultures there, and there are real disagreements lurking there that pop sometimes into visibility and could pop into a lot more visibility.
Yeah, so just to spell this out, this is why I think this is a futurist related topic, is that I do think technology is super core to what comes next in the culture wars, or what just, is even possible in the culture wars, because, you mentioned TikTok there. A lot of what becomes, part of the consciousness and what we are forced to pay attention to or forced to talk about, it just comes from like random conversations on TikTok, or before that it was Tumblr, right, or Twitter. And so a lot of the current culture wars came directly out of that. And right now there's a big conversation about whether or not that's natural, or maybe Russia or China have their finger on a lot of these issues, and they definitely have somehow there's some involvement. So technology in terms of our means of communication is one element to this, and another element to this, it's science and what we are able to manipulate in the human body, I think is a huge part of this. So like surrogacy, we couldn't previously do surrogacy. It's like a new-ish thing. And so, that's a technologically driven phenomenon that is becoming controversial. Also the trans issue. I mean, hormone blockers didn't used to exist. I think that, wasn't like just mid 20th century that even existed as a thing. Before that, there was like makeup or like wigs or something. I'm not even too sure. So the more radical, the more powerful technology gets, the further you can go with stretching the bounds with any culture war topic. So like, let me just ask you, because I'm kind of curious, you're a part of the fur community. If it were possible tomorrow to not just put on, I'm not sure exactly even what people put on, but like a tail or ears or whatever happens, to put that on as like part of a costume, but to, do like a sci-fi scenario where someone can like, every child thinks, oh God, I'd love to be a bird, or I'd love to be a dragon or whatever. What if you could actually do that? Like we were able to manipulate your DNA to the extent that you could become some other animal. Would you, or would people in the furry community actually take advantage of that?
Some people 100%. Some people absolutely, without a doubt, 100%, no question, would take advantage. Would I personally? Look, I'm old now. I have a husband. I have a stable life. I am at a point in my life where that's not the sort of radical change that I'd be looking to make. But were I a little bit younger, and were it like genuinely this like sci-fi level technology, all this wild, have the perfect conditions laid out where, I could say I'm retaining intelligence, I'm retaining this, I'm doing this, blah, 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 knock off all these listed conditions, then yeah, it would be a very serious consideration for me. It would be something that would be innately appealing to me. But yes, for some others, unquestionably.
Yeah, okay, that's so fascinating. I can see this playing out in my mind right now. You just go 20 years in the future where people can to some degree or another do this, and then all of a sudden we're in like a racism 2.0 world where people are banning certain creatures from certain facilities, or separate drinking fountains for certain animals or whatever, and it's a huge political dispute. Okay, hopefully that doesn't happen to that degree, but it's so easy to imagine people, because the whole like thing that people do is we other people, and if people are self-selecting out of the human species, that's inherently becoming an other that people will judge others by. Okay, there.
Yeah, and because you're totally right about highlighting new technologies, and to really drill home on that with, say, the trans issue, there is absolutely a reason that in 2020X versus every previous year, this issue gains a great deal of salience. And it's because the technology gets to the right place where people can make very serious changes, and where it hits a tipping point where a significant number of people have decided they're going to make these changes. And the specific reason I want to highlight that, the specific reason I want to point to it, is people want to talk about medical, people want to say, it's a medical issue, this or that. It's something that maybe we can convince people out of, this or that. And saying, as soon as you expand the range of options available to people, some people are going to take those options, and that is never going away. We are never going to have a world where nobody will want to take exogenous hormones. where no rational person even will want to take exogenous hormones and conclude that this is the correct path for them. Like, that just isn't going to happen. There will always be some people who look at it, who look at the effects and say, I want those effects in my life. And yes, as more technological doors open, more culture wars inevitably come from those, as you have some people looking and saying, yes, I want this in my life, and some people saying, that looks crazy, get that away from me, why would you do that? And that is a very consistent trend of many culture war issues.
Oh yeah, and like a lot of people would be interested in tweaking various aspects of their biology if they could. Joe Rogan, who's widely known as being a transphobe, that's what he's always castigated as. He says all the time that if it were available for me to become a woman for like a day or a week or a year or whatever, I would absolutely do it. There's no way I would turn that down. It would be so fascinating. You see a whole nother like life from a whole nother vantage point, and how could you not take advantage of that? I mean, so even if Joe Rogan, I mean, he is Mr. Everybody, right? He's Mr. Normie and or normal viewpoint, I guess. If he's saying that, I bet that that's a super common view, and I get it. I mean, I'm kind of like involved in some biohacker communities. I don't really do much biohacking or anything, but I'm interested in that topic. And so many just random kind of normal people are all about tweaking their DNA at some level to see what they can do. And I do think that our culture is going to be impacted by this in pretty dramatic ways pretty soon. We're running out of time here a little bit, so maybe I'll jump to maybe just one or two more topics. One topic that I'm just curious to get your feedback on is, you work for Blocked and Reported, and it's interesting to think about that podcast only being around for a couple of years. It feels like it has really infiltrated the culture and become a fairly, even though it's a niche podcast in a niche world, that I think that your average soccer mom has not heard about it and never would hear about it. I feel like it's having a meaningful impact on the culture. I want to get your thoughts on this. And I was just recently listening to Sarah Hader's podcast, and they had Anna Kasparian on, and Anna Kasparian very famously has recently pivoted away from a lot of hard left viewpoints and has become more of kind of central left, I would say, or I'm not too sure. Her views have just become slightly more or less extreme. And she said it was because she listened to this podcast called Blocked and Reported, and it opened up her eyes to a lot of things that she just wasn't aware of. And just to throw it out there for anyone who hasn't heard Blocked and Reported, it's two journalists, Katie Herzog and Jesse Singal, and they do deep dives, like super crazy deep. They interview people. They really do due diligence as actual journalists. They don't just like BS like I do on this podcast. Like they're like real journalism. And a part of that is your work, Trace. Like you do a lot of that work on the ground. And I'm curious if you have any insights or anything to share about how you have seen culture shift and Blocked and Reported being a driver in that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to hesitate to attribute any one change to any specific change to, the work at Blocked and Reported. But what I will highlight is the way the ecosystem works, which is that there's a great mass of people out there who are vaguely interested in any number of the topics that Blocked and Reported covers. And there's a smaller group who are dedicated followers of one or another of the very many potential parasocial relationships there. And then you have the tier of people who are actually engaging with and interacting on a regular basis with people who are having these public central conversations. And once you get up to that tier, within certain subfields, that tier becomes very small indeed, where you can look at, say, I'm going to use effective altruism as an example. If a journalist writes an article about effective altruism and they want to criticize effective altruism, they will go to maybe 3 or 4 specific people who they know are the people who to talk to if you're going to criticize effective altruism. Really insufferable people too. Emil Tor is absolute. Anyway, but there are these like very specific people who they know can be the critics. If they're going to talk about pronatalism, say, they know they can go to, say, Diana Fleischman, they know they can go to Simon and Malcolm and Simone Collins and get pronatalist takes. And so you have what is really, in some areas, a single-digit number of people. Obviously, Blocked and Reported, Katie and Jesse are 2 of the people who people will look to for trans issues in specific, but more generally, the ecosystem as a whole is small enough and they know enough of the people in it, they're connected enough with it all, whether, some friendly, some less friendly, but that they are part of this conversation, as it were. And everyone who is with this, you start figuring out the ideological spheres that each of these commentators are in. You start figuring out, here are the progressives who hang out with the other progressives, here are the liberals, here are the conservatives, and you have overlap between some of these bubbles. Blocked and Reported is interesting because it occupies a spot at the overlap between several bubbles, where they're sort of cultural translators in a lot of ways, where Jesse is, a progressive liberal broadly, who has really hard disagreements with part of the progressive left and who is willing to go places a lot of people won't. Katie, similar position. So, and they spend a lot of their time criticizing excesses of the left and criticizing trends on the left, which draws a lot of conservatives to them and draws a lot of frustrated, quote unquote, heterodox people to them and so forth. But it also makes it a lot easier for progressives to listen to their criticism than for them to listen to the criticism from someone like Ben Shapiro or something. So Blocked and Reported and Ben Shapiro could cover the same topic, and the way Blocked and Reported covers it would be a lot more agreeable and a lot less inimical to a progressive, even if they're criticizing progressives, than Ben Shapiro doing the same thing. And it makes it a lot easier for them to say, okay, maybe there's something real here. So I'm not going to say I know exactly the specific degree to which it impacts people, but I think that ecosystem is really important to understand, the fact that there are very few people who are actually talking about any given issue in a way that others are paying attention to day by day, shockingly few people in any given issue, and that they stand at a really particular intersection, that in as much as the podcast has influence on culture, those are the reasons.
Podcasts are unique in that they're entertainment along with being informative at best. And this is why I do like Blocked and Reported a lot, and I see it influencing culture even directly, is that it's so entertaining that I don't mind sending it to my friends to be like, hey, check out this episode. This is hilarious. Even if they are of a political sort that they wouldn't necessarily agree with their viewpoints or whatever. It's just like there's an entertainment value there that I think is makes it shareable. But interestingly, Jesse has said before that the podcast has significantly less reach than something that is written. And so oftentimes he will cover a very similar topic in his Substack, and he will say that will have more cultural influence than the podcast, maybe because podcasts you do have to actually sit down and listen to, and it's more of a long form experience rather than like an essay. You can just jump to a paragraph and then, clip that and share it on Twitter or something. I'm not too sure, but like, is that your experience too, that the written word is still more powerful than a podcast? I'm like questioning this a little bit, but yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they play different roles. Written words, unless you are actively clipping viral bits from podcasts, then yes, you are not going to have anywhere near the same viral spread of a podcast. No one is going to, like, a podcast episode itself, you had maybe Serial, but like in general, a podcast episode is simply not going to go viral the same way an article or a tweet will. And what a podcast does is, it is, like you said, there is entertainment to it, and there's a certain comfort of the same audience coming to the same podcast time after time and sort of developing a parasocial relationship with with the hosts, and just appreciating their takes, getting their view gradually over a long period of time to them. And so you see like really dedicated and really passionate audiences come out of things like podcasts. Whereas, say, if you want virality, like, look, I've had a couple of tweets just in the past few months that have reached far, far, far more eyeballs than any Blocked and Reported episode. And that doesn't mean that my tweets are more culturally significant than the podcast. It just means that it is a lot easier to share a tweet and to condense a tweet and to make that tweet spread around, so it can have this moment of much greater visibility, much greater immediate impact, while the podcast does a lot of long-term audience building and long-term just like being the source for X number of people to hear about a bunch of different things. So they fill different roles. Writing absolutely is more viral than podcasts, so yes.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, that maybe is my experience too. Twitter or any social media platform with a share feature, it is still so powerful. And like the algorithm is so powerful. I mean, any of my like quote claims to fame in life, like as a writer, it all was because someone just retweeted me, like like Steven Pinker retweeted me once, and then that was a very active, exciting day in my life, because it's like, oh, like it had nothing to do with the quality of my essay or whatever, why people were reading this, because like, oh, Steven Pinker retweeted it. So yeah, that the power of the algorithm and the power of like the 1% of people who just drive audience eyeballs on certain social media platforms. Oh man, it's so powerful. It's kind of terrifying at the same time. Um, I'm yeah, I have like 50 more topics I had written down to go over with you, but running out of time. Um, but yeah, I just want to kind of know, like, you cover a lot of topics in your writing, and you have a lot of interests. What are you up to next? And are there any particular areas that you are going to be researching or writing about in the near future?
That's a good question. So with law school, I have less time than I would like to do a lot of my independent stuff. Between law school and Boston Report, and I end up being stretched pretty thin some of the time. So I'm still working on finishing up a couple of my prior investigations, things on like the FAA and on
Oh yeah.
Brian Johnson and so forth. I'm still working on tying up some loose ends there. The next big project I really have in mind, look, there are a lot of essays that I want to write, but those aren't the sort of projects that are really worth talking about. They'll come out when they come out. I am looking and doing a deep dive into more stuff connected with effective altruism, into looking at a couple of historical stories of people there who want a little bit of a deeper dive, a closer look into some things that went on with them. So we'll see where that takes me. And other than that, I always just try to keep my ear to the ground and look for things that I think other people aren't going to be, the things where if I don't say something, no one is going to say the right thing about it, are the things that really catch my attention, and that I can't always say in advance what will catch my attention and how.
Excellent. Well, I love that. And yeah, I think that is, if anything else, that is the reason to follow Tracing Woodgrains. It is tracingwoodgrains.com, or also on Twitter. And yeah, you do a fabulous job of, I think, unearthing topics that no one else is talking about. So yeah, keep up that great work. And thanks for coming on today. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.